If you're familiar with me or my content or my taste, you may already be aware, bright headphones are my kryptonite. And there are few brands out there that are better known for consistently releasing bright headphones than HIFIMAN. They have a few lineups of headphones that are incredibly well respected, like the Ananda lineup or the Aria lineup or the HE1000 lineup or the Sesvara lineup, all of which, every revision of all of those lineups has been way too bright for me, which is why this is so interesting. So this is the Edition XV. It's their $400 successor to the Edition XS. And yeah, as someone who never really considered buying a planar magnetic headphone because they all trend so bright on my head, the Edition XV is giving me something to think about. So let's talk about why. So real quick, I just want to make sure I mention that this was sent to me by HIFIMAN. So thanks for sending it to us, HIFIMAN. This is a review unit. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to keep this. All of the thoughts and opinions and experiences related in this video are going to be my own. Obviously, they did not pay me to say anything about this headphone. So let's start with the accessories. And this is where the Edition XV isn't really different at all from the Edition XS. It comes with the same cable, that same dual 3.5mm TRS connection to the 3.5mm stereo jack on the end that comes out of the right angle. And it comes with a 6.3mm or quarter-inch TRS adapter, and then it comes with that little HIFIMAN foam stand that helps keep it in place in the box. So touching on the cable, I actually kind of love this cable. It doesn't look like much, but it's very soft. It's the right length and it doesn't really tangle at all. I think as far as like included stock cables with headphones near this price range, I absolutely prefer this to all of the other headphones I've received that are anywhere near this price. So, and actually I also really like the little foam stand it comes with. I think a lot of the people who are going to be buying a headphone in this price range, this may be their first high-end expensive headphone. So I really think the foam stand is a nice touch because it means they're not just going to put it on their desk when they're done, like any other less expensive or less special headphone. They're going to put it on their nice little stand that they got from HIFIMAN. So yeah, while it's not extravagant or anything like that, I do think every part of the accessories package here works really well. In this price range, it actually does quite a bit better than most of the other headphones I've seen. Okay, so let's talk about the build. And this is definitely immediately different upon visual inspection versus any of HIFIMAN's older headphones. So if we just talk about the visual design of it really quick, I actually really like it. It reminds me of the recently released Moondrop Horizon, but done in a more like silverish colorway where you get kind of a bunch of little grill spots and you can see right through to the driver. I also really like how it's like a coherent color for the entire outward facing part of the headphone. So the headband, the yoke, and the cup all being the same color just adds a nice visual coherence that I think wasn't really there on past designs. So very pleased with the visual design being more simplified in some ways, like the colorway, but also a little bit more elegant and refined in touches like the grill. In terms of the comfort, there are some things we're going to need to talk about here because it does have a new headband, and this headband is better than the Edition XS headband, but still has issues of its own. So unfortunately, I think the head strap here is both a little bit too short as well as a little bit too like stiff and tight because the travel on the x-axis is limited by the length of the strap. I do feel like it's a clampier headphone than most of the other HIFIMANs I've worn, and I don't really have that big of a head, so it's not a huge issue for me, but I think for some people with bigger heads, it actually might be an issue. And it's kind of a shame because there's actually a lot of room between the strap and the headband, such that I actually think they could have made it longer with basically no downsides to comfort, and it would have been better for the clamp and less limiting, but it also may have actually conformed better to the top of the head. So while it's better than a non-suspension strap and something I can definitely wear for a few hours at a time, I do still think it could have been more comfortable. So Capra Audio has a strap for the Edition XS that is confirmed to work with this headphone. And yeah, I'm going to be putting that on this as soon as possible because those straps are a lot more flexible. They conform very well to the overall shape of my head, and I think it's just going to make this an even better headphone for long-term use. So let's go ahead and talk about the sound, because that's where this thing really gets interesting. So right away, I think the narrative around this headphone is the dark HIFIMAN. And I think, yeah, it is that, but I don't want people to come away thinking that's the only difference here. So real quick, I'm just going to show you the measurement here. This is a measurement done on my clone Gross system, but I'm going to lead you through the interpretation here because I think a lot of people won't be that familiar with my measurement rig, and we don't have one of these to resolve yet, so we can't get 5128 measurements, but those will be coming soon. So first I want to talk about the bass here, and I feel like I want to first address that a lot of people seem to think of bass that extends linearly as a bit of a monolith, like all of the headphones that have a similarly well extended bass response, like a planar magnetic headphone, will sound reasonably similar, but we we got to remember, it's all about how the bass plays against the mid-range and plays against the treble. It's a complex interwoven network of stuff that leads to how we unpack the sound of a headphone. So just because it has linearly extended bass, don't expect it to sound like the other HIFIMANs, because it really doesn't. So first I want to talk about the fact that there is no bass shelf or bass rise here. It is very much linear from the bass to the mids with no tilt at all, which means you don't get any emphasis of bass over mid-range. So that means you don't get that pumpy kind of bouncy kick drum or bass guitar presentation. Instead, you get this more rounded kind of woody presentation that gives the overtones of bass instruments, I think, a little bit more emphasis versus the fundamentals. It's a presentation I tend to prefer to the rotund, plump sound of a, bass shelf. I actually think the Edition XV has a much more Odyssey-like bass presentation than a HIFIMAN-like one. And I think that's largely owed to how relaxed the treble is. It's so relaxed that it actually brings everything under 2 kilohertz or so, like up in volume, such that this is not the typical HIFIMAN bass presentation, and it's a lot closer to an Odyssey where you get that kind of thick, thuddy, potentially boxy bass presentation. So moving into the mid-range, this is where I think, again, the treble change actually has a pretty profound effect. So it doesn't sound like the traditional HIFIMAN headphone where there's kind of this spotlighting effect on the very small cues of vocalists because the treble forwardness, brings forth a lot of the kind of wispy little breath sounds and mouth clicks and stuff like that. Instead, it's a mid-range focused headphone that keeps that 2 kilohertz dip shape. So you get this more soft, diffuse presentation, but it's not paired with that contrast that comes from a boosted treble region. It sounds warm, perhaps a little bit muffled if you're less forgiving of warm signatures. This is fine for me. I think if there were one thing I could change about the headphone with EQ, it probably would be bringing up the 1800 hertz area a little bit to kind of bring a little bit more clarity to the situation. Okay, so now let's talk about the treble, where this is pretty exceptional. It just feels so weird to say about a HIFIMAN headphone because most of their headphones just haven't worked for me. Like the Aria, the HE1000, Successor, Ananda, the Edition XS, the HE400 SE, the Sundara, all of them are too bright for me. And this one isn't just not bright, it's one of the best treble responses I've ever heard, which kind of makes it tough to talk about the treble here because all of the things I usually look for to nitpick a treble response, like excess sibilance or breath sounds or mouth clicks on a vocal, or, too much sizzle or hash or ringiness on cymbals, or too much of the plasticky plucked character on acoustic guitars. All of these things that I would normally have issues with in most headphones, I'm not finding any issues here. So I don't really have much to say here, not only because it works so well for me, but because I can't be sure that it's going to work as well for you, because heads and ears are just different. Now, I will say, even for me, who finds the treble response very smooth, easy to listen to, I think it's likely that a lot of HIFIMAN's typical fans won't like this headphone because of how dark it is. And I also think that a lot of people who like the intangible aspects of the typical HIFIMAN presentation, so like the soundstage or the detail, they're going to find this one just kind of worse in those aspects. So actually, let's talk about all the subjective stuff. Before I start talking about things like the soundstage, I want to make sure I preface it by saying, because the frequency response on two people's heads is going to be vastly different, it's hard to say one person's impression is going to carry over to another person when it comes to things like soundstage. But the other problem is that headphones don't really do soundstage like speakers or sounds in the real world. And I have an article all about that, which you can read linked in the description. But I guess my point here is that if you've actually not had the chance to hear headphone soundstage before, do not prioritize it in your purchasing decision because it is this incredibly nebulous, hard to pin down thing in the audiophile sphere that I think frankly most audiophiles don't even understand. That all out of the way, the Edition XV is probably the most spacious HIFIMAN I've heard, but that's because unlike all of the other, Aria, Ananda, HE1000, Successor, Edition XS headphones out there, all of those have a screaming 10 kilohertz peak on my head that brings all of the elements closer to the center and closer to my eyes. This doesn't have that peak. So instead of there being this kind of incoherence between a distant mid-range due to the 2 kilohertz dip and a very close treble presentation, I instead get this kind of distant presentation, which isn't really precise in the way that I think one of the brighter HIFIMANs may be, but has the benefit of not being as cloyingly close for things like vocal details. So I think a lot of people maybe will hear it as just kind of distant and cloyingly so, But for me, this is actually the first HIFIMAN where I'm able to get that spaciousness presentation without the downside of the tuning just not working at all for me. In terms of detail, I think it is a darker headphone and it is less detailed in the treble area because it is so much less bright. But I actually do feel like this offers more of a microscope into the low mid-range and center mid-range where a lot of the texture for bass instruments is. It brings forth a lot of the kind of reedy overtones of bass that other HIFIMANs really don't do. And I think in terms of dynamics as well, this is kind of the best one I've heard from HIFIMAN since, you know, the HE6. And the HE6 was a very different presentation of dynamics. It was a lot more about snap and attack and precision, whereas the Edition XV is not really about those things. It's more about weight and density. So yeah, I think people that like the typical HIFIMAN presentation of dynamics that has that kind of effortless chill about it, this has less of that, even though it's darker. Like, I feel like it's, again, more like an Odyssey headphone where there's this kind of weight conferred to drums that is really appealing. So to that end, let's start comparing this to other things. So the obvious comparison is going to be the Edition XS, which is a lot brighter, is a little bit more downsloped in the bass as well. So the impression I get with Edition XS is that it's a lot more of a warm, bright, kind of sneaky V-shaped thing where it does have an emphasis of the bass over the mid-range. So it's a little bit cloudier, but the bass is a little bit more prominent for people who want a more prominent feature of the bass over the mid-range. But I actually think I prefer the presentation of the XV for bass. I think it's more of a toneful, kind of complete bass presentation that doesn't focus so much on bass and instead kind of just gives you a clearer picture of all the information down there. The mid-range, I think, is similar in isolation. Like, if you just normalize the two in the mids, they would probably look very similar. But because the Edition XS is so much brighter, and it is so much brighter than this headphone. On the XV, the mid-range is the star of the show, and on the XS, it's kind of the opposite, where the bass and treble definitely overwhelm the mid-range. And, you know, that kind of leads to some things like potentially soundstage or potentially detail being more interesting to people. But for me, it's a clean sweep. The XV has a better dynamics presentation. It's a spatial presentation that is less cloyingly disjointed and half in my face, half distant. And in terms of its detail, while it has less things thrown in my face, it has a better presentation of texture on the things I really care about and less priority on the things that, honestly, the mix engineer was probably trying to hide, like vocal sibilance or the little breath sounds and stuff like that. And of course, the XV is more comfortable because it has the better headband. Okay, so now let's talk about the Sony MDR MV1, which has been my choice in this price range for a more V-shaped, bass extended kind of sound signature. The Sony MDR MV1 is definitely way more V-shaped than the Edition XV. The Edition XV is more of just a warm headphone. And I think when it comes right down to it, I probably do prefer the Edition XV because, for one, I am not someone who really goes for a V-shaped presentation all the time. It's fun as an alternative signature, but most of the time I just want something that sounds normal. So the MV1 is definitely more vivid, but it definitely has issues with sibilance and excess bass on certain recordings. I think overall it has the same level of bass extension, but it's less bass heavy, which I prefer. The mid-range is a little bit more center mid-range focused on this, which again, I also prefer. And the treble is dark in a way that works really well for my head. So I think for people who want that kind of vivid signature, the MV1 is probably still what they're going to want to go for. But when it comes to personal preference, this is just kind of better in any aspect I can really think of for the sound quality. And even though it's not quite as lightweight, I do still prefer the comfort of this one as well. Okay, so now I want to depart this price range for a second and talk about the Odyssey MM500, which has been my preferred planar magnetic headphone for a while. Not that it's perfect, but it has the least issues in the treble for my head, and its mid-range is reasonably neutral, and it has the full extended bass. But the MM500 still has its issues. I think it's a little too dark in some spots and a little too bright in others. The mid-range is a little bit too lean, I think, for the rest of its response, and the bass really doesn't have much going for it. And I think the comfort is honestly quite poor with that headphone. The Edition XV, I think, is just a better headphone, and it may not be quite as neutral in the mid-range, but I think for everything else, like for its bass, I feel like it has a more compelling kind of forward character to it. And I think that's probably because, one, it has the 2 kilohertz dip on this headphone, which brings the bass more forward relative to the upper mid-range, even though it's just linear bass like the Odyssey. But it also still has that treble darkness, which again brings the low mid-range and bass both forward relative to everything else. So I think the bass is more tactile and more engaging here, even if it's similar to the MM500, not the star of the show or anything like that. And the treble, I feel like, is just an outright win for the Edition XV. The MM500 is dark in a spot I'm specifically sensitive to, which is great, but the lower treble is too recessed. It has a big dip around 4 to 5 kilohertz, and it does make things sound really muffled and incoherently so because of how lean the mid-range is. And then it also has a really big bright spot around like 13, 14 kilohertz on my head, which isn't my usual pain point, so I forgive it. But this doesn't have any of that. It doesn't have that muffled character that you get from the 4 to 5 kilohertz dip, and it doesn't have the excess brightness around 13 to 14K either, while also still having the darkness around 10 to 11 kilohertz that I like. Even though the MM500 may be more linear in a critical band of the music, the mid-range, this comes across as way more coherent and it makes a lot more sense. And it also has more of a spaciousness, dynamics, detail thing going on because the idiosyncrasies it goes for just kind of work better for me. So now let's go back to the price range of this headphone and talk about probably the most important comparison to make, which is the Sennheiser HD6XX or 650, the gatekeeper of this price range of headphones. I think it's important to kind of note what the flaws in those headphones traditionally have been, which has been their lack of bass extension, and for a lot of people, the treble not being smooth on their head, either having very big dips in the mid treble that result in a very dark, muffled presentation, or if you're like me, a bit too much brightness around 5 kilohertz and 10 kilohertz. And I think it's also worth noting that, the HD650 is a very stable headphone. You know it's going to last a long time, but it's not the most comfortable headphone for someone like me who really needs a suspension strap. I really dislike the 2-nugget design of those headbands. And I also really dislike how small the cups are. They're ear-shaped and they fit the tallness of my ear just well enough, but they're not really a deep ear pad, especially because those pads wear over time. So with all of that in mind, I think the Edition XV is the first time a company that isn't Sennheiser has offered a compelling, warm, neutral alternative to the HD650. And keep in mind, I haven't heard things like the AR5000. I know that's something people say about that headphone, but this is surprisingly good all around, not just in one area of the frequency response, which is what's important about the 6 series, is that they have this excellent mid-range, but they also don't compromise crazily in the bass and treble. They're reasonable. This is better in the bass. It just has better bass extension, and I feel like the relationship between bass and mid-range is just more complete, more resolute, makes more sense, is a better representation of the music, and the treble actually works a lot better on my head versus the 6 series. It doesn't have that kind of graininess around 5 kilohertz or that kind of sharpness around 10 kilohertz that I get with even the HD650, while also not dipping quite as strongly around 7 kilohertz on my head. So it's just a kind of overall more smooth listen for me in the treble. Now, the mid-range is definitely not as good on this versus an HD650. It's not as neutral. It's not as well representative of vocals, guitars, snare drums, pianos, horns, string instruments. All of that stuff does just kind of sound more normal on the HD650. But I think as an alternative, if you can deal with a 2 kilohertz dip, this may be the more well-rounded headphone for a lot of people, especially because it's a more comfortable headphone than the HD650, at least for me, who again needs a suspension strap, needs larger cups, and for someone like me with long hair, the fact that it's also a more leak tolerant design and a small break in the seal isn't going to make the bass all disappear is a good thing. So yeah, while the 6 series has a better mid-range presentation, I think that the bass and treble and the comfort of this headphone works better for me, and for that reason I'll probably reach for this one first because it's more comfortable and the treble's smoother for me. While I'm not going to say it's an outright better headphone, this is shockingly close as a balance of compromises. While I think this headphone does have its downsides, like it's not as comfortable as it could be, it's not as light as it could be, and it's not perfect across its tonal response. Like I think it's a little bit overwarmed of a headphone, it's a little bit soft. For me, it gets enough right that I'm comfortable mentioning it in the same breath as frankly the best headphones of all time, which is not nothing. Like, yeah, it has the bass extension of the Edition XS or the Sony MDR MV1 without the compromises you make in the treble if you're a more treble sensitive listener like I am, but it also has the more kind of warm presentation of the 650 without compromising on the bass. And I think for a lot of people it's going to be more comfortable than the 650 too. So it is a landmark release for HIFIMAN, and I think probably one of the most important headphones that's come out in my time in the hobby. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you want to discuss this headphone, definitely check out the forum link below where there will be a thread just for discussing this headphone, and I'll have some of my measurements posted there. I'll also have a written review, so if you prefer the written review format, you can check out that, which will also be linked below. And if you want to discuss anything else about audio, feel free to just reach out to me on the forum at forum.headphones.com or our Discord server at discord.gg/headphones. It's been Listener from headphones.com. Y'all have a good rest of your day. Later.